What happens when a former royal sits down for what should be a routine late-night talk show appearance, only to find herself in the most explosive television confrontation in recent memory? Tonight, we're diving deep into the shocking events that unfolded when Meghan Markle appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, an interview that was supposed to promote her latest philanthropic venture, but instead became a verbal battlefield that left studio audiences stunned and network executives scrambling. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me what you think really happened behind the scenes, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about live television drama. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan walked onto the Ed Sullivan Theatre stage. Those familiar with The Late Show know that Stephen Colbert typically maintains a balance between humor and serious discussion, but sources inside the studio that evening described an atmosphere unlike anything they had witnessed in years of working on the show. The usual pre-interview banter between host and guest was noticeably absent, replaced by what one crew member described as an icy politeness that set everyone on edge. Meghan had arrived at the theater earlier that afternoon for the standard rehearsal and technical run-through. Multiple sources confirmed that during these preliminary sessions, there were already signs that this would not be a typical celebrity interview. The planned talking points, which had been carefully coordinated between Meghan's team and the show's producers weeks in advance, seemed to shift dramatically in the hours leading up to the live taping. What was originally intended to be a lighthearted discussion about Meghan's charitable work and upcoming projects had somehow evolved into something far more contentious. The show's producers had been walking on eggshells all day. Several staff members noted that there were multiple closed-door meetings throughout the afternoon, with Meghan's publicist and legal team making demands that went far beyond the usual guest requirements. They wanted certain topics completely off-limits, specific questions pre-approved, and even requested editorial control over how certain segments would be edited. Despite the fact that The Late Show typically tapes live-to-tape with minimal editing, Stephen Colbert, known for his sharp wit and ability to handle difficult guests, seemed unusually tense during the final preparation meetings. Sources close to the production revealed that he had expressed concerns about the increasing restrictions being placed on the interview content. As someone who built his career on satirical commentary and fearless questioning, the idea of conducting a heavily sanitized interview clearly didn't sit well with him. The audience filing into the theater that evening had no idea they were about to witness television history in the making. They came expecting the usual mix of comedy, music, and celebrity chat that The Late Show is known for. Instead, they would become unwitting participants in a confrontation that would dominate headlines and social media discussions for weeks to come. As the show's familiar theme music played, and Stephen took his position behind the iconic desk, there was an undercurrent of electricity in the studio that even the most casual observer couldn't ignore. The warm-up comedian had done his usual routine to energize the crowd, but several audience members later reported that something felt different, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. When Stephen began his opening monologue, he seemed to be going through the motions, hitting his usual marks and delivering his prepared jokes with professional precision. But those who knew him well could detect a subtle change in his demeanor. There was an edge to his humor that seemed sharper than usual, and his transitions between topics felt more abrupt than his typically smooth delivery. The first segment proceeded normally enough, with Stephen covering the day's political news with his characteristic blend of insight and comedy. The audience responded as expected, laughing at the appropriate moments and applauding when prompted. But as the show moved toward the guest interview segment, the atmosphere in the studio began to shift perceptibly. Behind the scenes, final preparations were being made for Meghan's entrance. Her team had insisted on several last-minute changes to the set arrangement, moving chairs to specific positions, and adjusting lighting in ways that struck the technical crew as unusual and unnecessarily complicated. These modifications delayed the show's progression and created additional tension among the production staff who were already dealing with an unusually high-stress situation. The stage manager's voice could be heard through headsets coordinating the complex logistics that had evolved around what should have been a straightforward celebrity interview. Camera operators were receiving modified instructions. Sound engineers were making adjustments to accommodate the new seating arrangement, and the show's director was clearly working overtime to manage all the moving pieces that had been thrown into motion by the day's developments. As Stephen prepared to introduce his guest, there was a moment of unusual silence in the studio. The typical energy that builds before a celebrity entrance seemed muted, replaced by something that felt more like anticipation mixed with apprehension. Even the audience seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold, though they had no way of knowing just how dramatic the next hour would become. The introduction itself was delivered with Stephen's professional polish, but careful observers noted subtle changes in his typical guest introduction style. His words were chosen more carefully than usual. His smile seemed slightly forced, and there was a tension in his voice that suggested he was preparing for something far more challenging than a routine celebrity chat. As Meghan made her entrance onto the stage, the audience erupted in the expected applause and cheers. She moved, with the poise and confidence that had become her trademark, waving to the crowd and taking her seat across from Stephen with practiced grace. But even in those first moments, there were signs that this interview would be anything but ordinary. The initial pleasantries were exchanged with professional courtesy, but both host and guest seemed to be maintaining a careful distance that was unusual for the Late Show's typically warm and welcoming atmosphere. Stephen's opening questions were delivered with his characteristic charm, but there was an underlying formality that suggested both participants were very much aware they were stepping into potentially dangerous territory. The first few minutes of the interview proceeded according to the carefully negotiated script. Stephen opened with questions about Meghan's recent charitable initiatives, allowing her to discuss her work with women's empowerment and educational programs. Her responses were polished and articulate, delivered with the media training that had served her well throughout her public life. The audience responded positively, and for a brief moment it seemed like the evening might unfold without incident. But then Stephen began to veer away from the approved talking points. His transition was so smooth that most viewers probably didn't notice the shift, but those familiar with interview dynamics could sense the subtle change in direction. Instead of moving to the next pre-planned topic, Stephen leaned back in his chair with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and asked a question that immediately changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. "You know, Meghan, there's something I've been curious about," Stephen said, his tone remaining conversational, but carrying an undercurrent that made everyone in the studio pay closer attention. "You've spoken extensively about your commitment to authenticity and truth-telling, but there seems to be some disconnect between public statements and documented facts in several instances. How do you reconcile that?" The question hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Meghan's practiced smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered her composure, but that brief moment was enough to signal that the carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Her response was measured, but there was a defensive edge that hadn't been present in her earlier answers. "I think that's a rather loaded question, Stephen," she replied, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone, but with a steel underneath that hadn't been there moments before. "I've always been committed to speaking my truth, and I think anyone who suggests otherwise might want to examine their own motivations for questioning that commitment." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the light-hearted banter they had come to expect from late-show interviews. Stephen, however, seemed energized by the pushback. His journalist instincts, honed during years of political commentary and hard-hitting interviews, were clearly kicking in. "But that's exactly what I'm getting at," Stephen continued, leaning forward slightly. "The phrase, 'my truth,' is interesting because it suggests there might be multiple versions of the same events. When you made certain claims about your experiences, and then documentation emerged that seemed to contradict those claims, How do you explain that discrepancy? Meghan's posture stiffened visibly. The transformation was remarkable to witness, sources later reported. The composed, media-savvy personality that had walked onto the stage was being replaced by someone who was clearly not accustomed to being challenged so directly in a public forum. I find it concerning that you would come at me with this kind of aggressive questioning, Meghan responded, her voice rising slightly. This feels more like an ambush than an interview. I was told we would be discussing my charitable work and future projects, not relitigating past events that have been thoroughly addressed. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, as they captured what was clearly becoming a confrontation rather than a conversation. Stephen, to his credit, maintained his professional demeanor, but there was a determination in his expression that suggested he had no intention of backing down. I appreciate that you might feel blindsided, Stephen said, his voice remaining calm but firm. But I think our audience deserves to have these questions addressed. You've built a public platform based on your personal narrative, and when elements of that narrative come into question, it's fair game for discussion. That's how journalism works? Journalism? Meghan's voice now carried a note of incredulity that was impossible to miss. Is that what you call this? Because it feels more like a hit job to me. I've been nothing but gracious in accepting your invitation to appear on this show, and this is how you repay that courtesy? The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost tangible. Audience members were looking around at each other with confused expressions, clearly unsure of how to react to what they were witnessing. The show's producers, watching from the control room, were facing a dilemma that no amount of experience could have prepared them for. Stephen's response was measured but pointed. I think there's a difference between courtesy and accountability. When public figures make claims that impact public discourse, those claims should be subject to scrutiny. That's not a personal attack, it's basic journalistic responsibility. Journalistic responsibility. Meghan's composure was now completely gone, her voice carrying an edge of anger that was impossible to disguise. You're hiding behind journalism to justify what amounts to a character assassination. I came here in good faith to discuss important work that I'm doing to make a positive difference in the world, and instead you're trying to drag me through some kind of public trial. The escalation was happening so quickly that even seasoned television professionals were struggling to keep up. What had started as a standard celebrity interview was rapidly devolving into something unprecedented in late-night television history. Stephen, perhaps sensing that he had pushed things to a critical point, attempted to dial back the intensity while still maintaining his position. Look, I'm not trying to put you on trial, he said, his tone becoming slightly more conciliatory. But I do think it's fair to ask questions when there are inconsistencies in public statements. That's not personal. It's just holding public figures to the same standard we would hold anyone else who chooses to be in the spotlight. But Meghan was beyond the point of accepting any olive branch. Her media training, which had served her well through countless interviews and public appearances, seemed to have completely abandoned her in this moment of high-pressure confrontation. The same standard? She fired back, her voice now carrying a tone that made everyone in the studio acutely uncomfortable. I don't think you would subject other guests to this kind of hostile interrogation. This feels targeted, and frankly, it feels discriminatory. I have to wonder if there are other factors at play here that are influencing your approach to this interview. The implication hung in the air like a live wire. Stephen's expression hardened, and for the first time in the interview, his professional mask slipped slightly. The suggestion that his questioning was motivated by anything other than journalistic integrity was clearly a line that he was not prepared to let slide. I'm going to stop you right there, Stephen said, his voice taking on a firmness that commanded attention. I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've interviewed people from every background imaginable. My questions are based on documented facts and legitimate concerns that have been raised in multiple credible sources. If you want to discuss the substance of those concerns, I'm happy to do that. But I'm not going to sit here and be accused of bias when I'm simply doing my job. The confrontation had now reached a point where it was clear that neither participant was going to back down. What had started as a discussion about charitable work had transformed into a battle of wills that was playing out in front of a live studio audience and millions of television viewers. The atmosphere in the studio had become electric with tension, and it was clear that something had to give. Meghan sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Stephen maintained his position behind the desk with the determination of someone who had crossed a line and was committed to seeing where it led. The audience, caught between fascination and discomfort, seemed to collectively hold its breath as the confrontation entered its final phase. "You know—" "What, Stephen?" Meghan said, her voice taking on a tone that made everyone in the studio realize they were about to witness something unprecedented. "I think I've heard enough. This entire setup was clearly designed to embarrass me, and I'm not going to sit here and be subjected to this kind of treatment any longer." She began to shift in her chair as if preparing to stand, but Stephen wasn't finished. His years of experience handling difficult interviews had taught him that backing down at crucial moments often meant missing the most important part of the story. "I understand you're uncomfortable," Stephen replied, his voice steady, but unyielding. "But walking away doesn't address the legitimate questions that have been raised. If there are explanations for the inconsistencies we've discussed, now would be the time to provide them rather than simply dismissing the entire conversation." Meghan's response was swift and cutting. "Inconsistencies? You mean the lies that have been spread about me by people with their own agendas? I'm not going to dignify this circus with further participation. This is exactly the kind of toxic behavior that drove me away from public life in the first place." The irony of her statement, given that she was currently sitting on a television show specifically to maintain her public profile, was not lost on anyone in the studio. Stephen seized on the contradiction immediately. "But you chose to come back into public life," he pointed out, his tone becoming more pointed. "You've written books, given interviews, started podcasts, and accepted speaking engagements. You can't simultaneously court public attention and then claim immunity from public scrutiny. That's not how it works for anyone else, and it shouldn't work that way for you." This direct challenge seemed to be the final straw for Meghan. Her carefully maintained composure completely evaporated, and what emerged was raw anger that shocked everyone present. "How dare you?" she said, her voice rising to a level that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. "You have no idea what I've been through, what my family has endured, and the price we've paid for simply trying to live our lives with dignity. This attack on me is not just unprofessional, it's cruel, and it's personal." Stephen's response was measured but firm. "Nothing I've said has been personal. I've asked questions based on public statements and documented evidence. If you consider that an attack, then perhaps the issue isn't with the questions, but with the answers." The exchange had reached a point where it was clear that resolution was impossible. Both participants had staked out positions from which neither was willing to retreat, and the confrontation was spiraling beyond anything that could be contained within the normal boundaries of television discourse. Meghan stood up abruptly, her movement so sudden that it startled the camera operators who had to quickly adjust their shots to follow her. "I'm done with this," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the studio, despite the absence of her lapel microphone. "This is not what I agreed to, and I will not be a party to this kind of character assassination disguised as journalism." The studio fell into stunned silence. In decades of television production, most of the crew had never witnessed a guest simply walk out of a live interview. The logistics alone were staggering, the audience was confused and agitated, and the show's producers were facing a crisis that had no precedent in their experience. Stephen, to his credit, attempted to manage the situation professionally. "Meghan, I understand you're upset, but I think if we could just take a breath and continue this conversation in a more constructive way." but Meghan was beyond negotiation. "There is no constructive way to continue this," she interrupted, her voice carrying throughout the studio as she began to move toward the edge of the set. "This entire thing was a setup from the beginning, and I should have trusted my instincts when I sensed something was wrong during rehearsal." Her movement toward the exit triggered a flurry of activity behind the scenes. The show's stage manager was speaking urgently into his headset, trying to coordinate with the control room about how to handle the unprecedented situation. Camera operators were receiving conflicting instructions about whether to follow Meghan's exit or focus on Stephen's reaction. Stephen made one final attempt to salvage the interview. "If you have concerns about the questions or the format, we can address those," he said, speaking directly to Meghan even as she continued to move away from the interview area. "But walking away doesn't solve anything, and it certainly doesn't address the issues we've been discussing." Meghan paused at the edge of the set and turned back to face him, her expression a mixture of anger and what appeared to be genuine hurt. "The only issue here is your apparent belief that you have the right to put me through this kind of public humiliation. I came here as a courtesy, and this is how you've chosen to treat that courtesy." What happened next would become the most talked-about moment in late-night television history. Instead of simply leaving the set, Meghan addressed the studio audience directly, her voice carrying the trained projection of someone accustomed to public speaking. "I want everyone here to know that this is not what was promised," she said, gesturing toward the confused and uncomfortable audience. "You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you've been made unwilling participants in what amounts to a public ambush. This is not representative of the kind of respectful discourse that should characterize public media." The audience's reaction was mixed and uncertain. Some people began to applaud, though whether in support of Meghan or simply in response to her direct address was unclear. Others remained silent, clearly unsure of how to process what they were witnessing. Stephen, faced with a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond any hope of control, made the decision that would define the rest of the evening. Standing up from behind his desk, he addressed both Meghan and the audience with the kind of directness that had made him a respected figure in television journalism. "I respect your right to leave if you feel uncomfortable," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. "But I also have a responsibility to my audience and to the principles of honest journalism. The questions I asked were legitimate, and they were based on information that is already in the public domain. If that makes you uncomfortable, I understand, but I won't apologize for doing my job." This final statement seemed to crystallize the entire confrontation into a single moment of absolute clarity. Meghan, now clearly committed to her exit, delivered her parting words with the kind of dramatic finality that would ensure this moment would be replayed endlessly on social media and news programs. "Your job?" she said, her voice carrying a note of disdain that made everyone in the studio wince. "If this is what you call journalism, then journalism is dead. I came here in good faith, and I'm leaving with my integrity intact, which is more than I can say for this show." With that, she walked off the set, leaving behind a studio full of stunned audience members, bewildered crew members, and one very determined talk show host who had just presided over the most explosive interview in late-night television history. The aftermath in the studio was unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. Stephen, left alone at his desk with cameras still rolling and an audience that didn't know whether to laugh, applaud, or simply sit in shocked silence, had to make split-second decisions about how to proceed with the remainder of the show. What you've just heard is the complete account of one of the most dramatic confrontations in television history, a clash between two strong-willed personalities that escalated beyond anything either participant could have anticipated. The reverberations from this explosive interview would continue for weeks, but the raw drama of that evening in the Ed Sullivan Theater will be remembered as a defining moment in both careers. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible behind-the-scenes stories like this one, and drop a comment below telling me what you think was the real turning point in this confrontation. Was it Stephen's decision to go off script, Or was Meghan's reaction more dramatic than the situation warranted?